If you are new to our channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Obviously, if you can spend as much money as you want on gardening as you choose to. Just like car collecting. If you want to buy $1 million car from an auction, yeah, you can do that. But we want to try to make this as economically and affordable as possible. There is some startup expense. Yeah, anything you do, whether car collecting, auto repair, golf, model, plane flying, you got to spend some money to get into the program. Same thing with gardening. You're just not going to go out and dig a little tiny hole in the yard and throw some seeds in. Everything's going to be fine. There is some upfront expense, but there is some ways to do it on the cheap and even free to build your soil. Now, if you're growing in containers, you're growing in raised beds, then you're 99.9% of the time you're starting with very good soil because you're bringing that soil and you're bringing that compost in to fill those items with the good enriched soil. Those soils, those containers, those devices do get depleted of nutrients because you continue to grow food out of them. So we have to rebuild that as well as traditional ground. So we're going to talk about some of the ways in which you can do this on the cheap and the free. And Holly knows me better than anybody that if I can find a way to do something for free, make it my own, or get it on the cheap, that I will do that.
Definitely.
Yeah. And most times it turns out pretty good.
I'm not saying it doesn't.
Okay. All right.
Just sometimes the process is interesting. So anyway, soil is the life of your garden, whether in containers, raised beds, or the ground. And actually, it took us a few years to realize this. I told Joey this, but he didn't. Right. Who didn't believe me?
Yeah, I know.
So anyway, we had to learn this.
I've been wrong a couple of times.
Yeah,
okay.
So we had to learn this, and especially Joey, because he thought that you had to feed the plants or something. I'm not really sure.
Well,
but
on a farm, on a big agricultural landscape, you're not really feeding the soil. You're putting supplements in the soil to feed the plants to get them through that season. You continue to feed the plants, not the soil. So it's in the inorganic world, it's kind of backwards. You're feeding plants and not the soil. In the organic world and the sustainable world, you're feeding the soil to feed the plants.
Right.
Okay.
So that's where I guess his downfall was. So anyway, soil is important to your plants. One thing you can do is you can use free resources like leaves, coffee grounds, and then chemical and seed-free grass clippings. Why chemical-free?
Well, chemical-free grass clippings. Mainly, a lot of people put weed and feed on their yards in the springtime throughout the growing season. This weed and feed, it feeds the plants. It kills the broadleaf plants or weeds that are in your yard. So what happens is that contains a chemical called 2,4-D. When that chemical is removed as a grass clipping and either put in your compost pile and or laid in your garden as a mulch, that 2,4-D residue is still prevalent even through the composting process. So when it waters, or when it rains, when you water, that chemical leaches into the soil, and what is the majority of the plants that you're growing in your garden? Broadleaf plants. And it kills those plants. So even if you have it through a composting procedure, that doesn't kill that persistent chemical, that 2,4-D residue. But if you're using an organic weed and feed that contains corn gluten meal, which is an inhibitor to seed germination in your lawn, you're fine. It's not an issue. One of our fertilizer sponsors, Sustain Natural Fertilizer, they have a corn gluten-based weed and feed, and corn gluten is just the byproduct of the beer industry when they extract all the juice out of the corn kernel, and then they turn it into a powder. If I understand that correct with that. So grass clippings are great if you know what has been used on that lawn. And they don't have seeds. Obviously, if you put seeds in your garden, you're going to have a garden full of weed seeds.
Right. And so, definitely. So one question we get a lot is, well, especially when we're talking about mulch, is wood chips. Not that people are adding wood chips to their soil to enhance it, but if you want to use them as mulch, is that good or bad? And obviously, wood chips do take a lot longer down than any other mulch or additive that you're putting to your foil.
You can add it with what is called the back-to-Eden garden method, where you layer inches and sometimes, in some instances, feet, a foot or two of wood chips on a growing surface, and you allow it to begin to break down and decay and feed the soil. It works itself into the soil. You do not, and this can take several years to make it happen. You do not want to get wood chips and then till them into your garden, because yes, the wood chips will break down into the soil, but they rob the soil of the available nitrogen in order to have that breakdown process that occurs to get that black soil that we're familiar with in the center of a giant wood pile that's been sitting there for 5 or 10 years. So wood chips are great. They make great mulch to suppress weeds and hold moisture. Those are really good for like asparagus beds, raspberry patches, anything perennial, rhubarb, something like that, where you're not going to disturb the soil for years upon years. You can layer that down, and it works really well. Again, walk paths works well as that. But you, again, don't mix it in the soil because it will rob the soil of nitrogen, and then you're going to have to supplement that with something else. Let's talk about coffee grounds.
Yeah, coffee grounds add a good boost of nitrogen to your soil. You can get them. You can save your own. Or you can go to a local coffee shop. A lot of times if you give them a call ahead of time, say, if I bring a bucket, will you save coffee grounds for me? And they are more than happy to usually. And then you go drop it off, pick it up a few days later, and you're good to go.
And the coffee grounds, against common belief, coffee grounds do not make your soil acidic. The coffee process removes nearly all of the acidity in that bean or in the grounds. The coffee grounds is a good nitrogen supplement for or a green product for your compost pile. It'll allow it to heat up quicker, as well as it's good for an organic matter, and worms love it.
Right. If you feel like you're not having enough worms in your soil, maybe you dig and you don't find a lot of worms, you just find a few here or there. If you add coffee grounds, the worms are going to come and find it and work the coffee grounds in. If you feed the worms, they will come.
Right. You work the coffee grounds in because they do contain about some instances up to 2% nitrogen, and you just broadcast them on your garden, that nitrogen will evaporate into the atmosphere and you'll lose that. So you want to work them into, and this is good for containers, for raised beds, for traditional ground. It doesn't have to be just ground garden. Again, with containers, you don't have that worm population, especially in 5, 10, 15 gallon containers, and you don't need it because you're adding that good enriched organic compost or that good rich soil that you're in that container. You don't want to put worms in there because worms have a very unique living conditions. If it's too wet, they go deeper. If it's too wet, they go deeper. If it's too dry, they go deeper. In a container, if you overwater, they're going to sit there and drown. Or if you let it dry out too much, they're going to die from dehydration. So you keep that in mind. What else do we have here? Let's talk about greens and browns when it comes to a homemade compost from a hot compost pile. That is the key if you're going to do a compost pile.
Right, because that hot compost is going to kill off those weed seeds, and that's what you want. If you just do a more passive cold compost like we do,
and we're changing that.
And we're changing that. But as we currently have, we still have weed seeds in our compost. So, whatever works for you. But the hot compost, you need a high amount of greens, which are the nitrogen. So that would include things like coffee, the coffee grounds, green
kitchen
scraps, grass clippings, any of those type of things. And then the browns are things like if you had like shredded paper or twigs or even leaves.
Dry material. 50% of each is ideal. The perfect compost pile, what the professionals say, is 1 cubic yard, which is 3 foot by 3 foot cube. But obviously we don't always have that size compost pile. So anything that you can make, and then some people say turn it every 3 to 5 days. Other people say let it sit there. So whatever, you've got to do your research on that particular aspect of it to make it work best for you. But there's some free and cheap resources in which you can use to build your soil. Thank you for checking out the Wisconsin Vegetable Gardener radio show. For more, go to the WisconsinVegetableGardener.com for full-length in-studio video and podcast replay of Season 1. Season 2 underway and added weekly. Tweet us at TWVG Show or hashtag TWVG to be part of the program.